Welcome to the Harness demo. What we're looking at here is a single pane of glass view across all applications and services. So you can see on the right hand side, we've got all the applications. We've got the deployment frequency in the last 30 days, the success and failure of those deployments. And what we can do is we can click in and we can see the exact status of an application or service. So for example, the environments, the compute instances, the versions, the actual infrastructure it's running on, and then a complete history of all of the deployments that have occurred for that application or service. What we can do is we can go and kick off a new deployment. So I'm manually going to kick off a deployment. With Harness triggers, you can automate this process. You can see that some pipelines have already run. So let's imagine I'm a developer or deployment team. I'm going to pick my application. I'm going to pick the pipeline that I want to run. And then what Harness is going to do is it's going to automatically integrate and pull all of the versions within your CI tool or your artifact repository. So you can see here. So I'm going to pick the latest version and I'm going to click submit. And our deployment pipeline has begun. We can see we're running some security scans on the application. In a few seconds, it's going to set up the development environment. So it's going to use Kubernetes. On the right hand side, you can see we're configuring the Kubernetes controller. So we're just preparing the pods, and then eventually we're going to deploy the new containers, and then it's going to verify to make sure everything's good. You can see it's completed. We're now moving on to our QA deployment stage. And this time, again, it's going to set up the containers in the QA environment using Kubernetes. It's going to deploy. And this time we're going to run a smoke test, regression test, and integration test. So you can integrate your test automation platforms within these Harness deployment workflows, and it'll literally take you minutes. You can see that the QA stage has completed, and now we're at stage 3, which is a manual approval. So with Harness, you can have as many manual approvals as you want in your pipeline, or it can be fully automated. I'm going to go ahead and approve, and what we're going to do is now promote the code into production. And we're going to do this using a Canary deployment. So you can see phase 1 of the Canary. We're going to take 25% of the Kubernetes cluster. We're going to deploy the new version and keep the old version running on 75%. And then we're going to use Harness verification to see if it's performing and if there's any new errors or exceptions that have been introduced as part of the deployment. So at this particular point on the right, you can see we've just deployed the containers to Kubernetes. The pods are coming up. And in a few seconds, we should see some verification. We're going to use New Relic and we're going to use Elastic to look at the performance and the quality of the application. So you can see that all of the performance checks in New Relic were consistent. There was no performance anomalies, and the same in the application logs. There's no new errors or exceptions there. So we've now gone on to phase 2 of the deployment, and we're now upgrading 50% of the environment. And again, we're going to check New Relic and Elastic to see if there's any regressions or anomalies with deploying to 50% of the environment. So in a few seconds, hopefully the pods will come up for 50% of the app, and we'll see if it managed to verify successfully. You can see the verification has failed. And if we look in New Relic, you can see 2 transactions have increased in response time. One from 89 milliseconds to 125, one from 178 to 251. And as a result, we're actually rolling back the application. So part of the verification process is to understand the business impact. And if there's regressions or anomalies, Harness is going to automatically roll back the application. We can also check in the application logs, and you can see in Elastic, we've noticed 4 new anomalies. And in one click, we can see the actual stack trace of the exception we've introduced. So Harness looks at things from a time series metrics perspective, as well as the application logs. And all this is unsupervised using machine learning. And what we can see is we're now rolling back all of the deployments to the last working version of the application. So in short, Harness automates the deployment. It automates the health checks and the verification of a deployment, and it also automates the rollback as well. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a pipeline from scratch. So I'm going to click Setup, and then we've got a series of options here. If you don't like our user interface, you can click Configuration as Code. And there's a complete YAML API that allows you to build all of your pipelines using YAMLs. So for example, you've got services, environments, workflows, and then pipelines. Here's all of the YAML. And again, we've got integration with Git, so you can specify a branch and you can have bidirectional sync if you want to manage everything as code there. We also have connectors to all of your cloud accounts and data centers. So if you've got bare metal you want to define, if you've got Amazon accounts, you simply just put in your access keys and your secret key. We support Amazon, Azure, Google Cloud, Kubernetes, Pivotal, all of the common cloud providers. In addition to clouds, we've also got connectors to all your CI tools and artifact servers. So Docker Hub, Bamboo, Jenkins, Nexus. We're automatically going to pull the artifacts from these repositories. And that's really the only thing Harness requires, is access to a repository that we can pick artifacts from. In addition to that, we've got integration with Slack. So if you want to post any notifications, as well as Git for obviously the YAML, and then all your monitoring tools, Dynatrace, Elastic, Jenkins, AppDynamics, New Relic, Prometheus, Datadog, Splunk, Sumo Logic. These are all the native connectors that allows us to verify your applications. So what I'm going to do now is look at an application within Harness. An application is made up of services. These are your artifacts. These are things like AMIs, Docker images, Lambda functions, WAR files, zips, RPMs. These are the artifacts you're going to deploy to environments. We have environments, which is the infrastructure, dev, QA, staging, and production. We have workflows that allows you to deploy services to an environment. So you might have a workflow, a canary deployment for production. You might have a blue-green for load test or staging. And so you typically have multiple workflows for each environment. You then stitch those together into pipelines. And then to run pipelines, you would define a trigger that would run a pipeline on a specific condition. So if there's a new build or version of artifact, if it's a time of day, or even a webhook, you can run a pipeline. We also have a concept of infrastructure provisioner that allows you to reuse your current Terraform and CloudFormation scripts. So you can commission and decommission infrastructure as part of your deployment pipelines. Lastly, we've got application global variables. So if there's common variables you want to set, you can do it at the application level. Also, you can do it at the service level as well. So here's all my services. I'm going to go ahead and add a new service. So I'm going to create a new microservice. I can specify the artifact type. So you can see Docker, AMI, Code Deploy, Lambda, Jar, WAR, Zip, Pivotal, Cloud Foundry, even .NET and IIS applications as well. So I'm going to pick Docker, click Submit. The first thing we're going to do is link Harness to your artifact repository. So I'm going to point it to JFrog Artifactory. I'm going to point it to my server, give it the local repository, and then I'm going to give it path to the actual Docker image file. And that's it. That's Harness fully integrated with my artifact repository. So we'll automatically pick up and version control all of the new builds and versions. Given this is a Docker microservice, I can then specify my configuration for Amazon ECS, for Kubernetes, and for Helm. And so again, all of this is standard configuration required. This is all version controlled as well. So if anyone makes any changes to the config, we can roll back. Again, with Kubernetes, you've got your standard YAML file. So all of your controllers, your stateful sets, Istio rules, kind of variables, it's all defined here locally. Also support Helm. So if you've got Helm charts, you can reference those. If you want to add any variables at the service level or secrets, simply select the secret from the secret store. Harness has native integration with HashiCorp Vault and also Amazon KMS. So you can specify and reference all of the variables here. Once you've got your services defined, you can then define your environments. So I'm going to go and add a new staging environment for my microservice, if I can spell. I'm going to make it non-production. That's just metadata that allows us to kind of tag the environments. And then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add service infrastructure for my microservice. So I'm going to pick my microservice. I then select the deployment option. So I could select Amazon. I'm going to pick my Amazon account, click next, and then we're going to pre-populate all of the regions and the clusters that exist. And I can pick EC2 or I can pick Fargate. It's entirely up to you. So my first microservice is going to be deployed in Amazon. The great thing about Harness is it can have hybrid environments. So we've got a microservice running in Amazon. I could pick up another Docker container, and I could pick Kubernetes as the deployment type, and then I could pick GCP, Azure, or even my on-premise Kubernetes cluster. So I'm going to pick Google Cloud. I'm going to then give it a cluster that I want to deploy to, and then we're done. What we can also do is we can add on-premise. So I'm going to pick a Tomcat application. I'm going to use SSH as my deployment. I'm going to pick a physical data center, and I simply give it some host names, give it an SSH connection, and then it's going to provision the application using SSH. So you can have on-premise infrastructure, you can have public clouds, you can have a hybrid mix of any technology stacks, and that's going to define my environment. If I want to override configuration, I can basically do it at individual services, or I can say for all services in the environment, override my variable to whatever value I want. And that's going to persist whenever services use this environment. Once you have environments set up, you can then create workflows. Workflows allow you to deploy services to an environment. So I'm going to click Add Workflow, and what we're going to do is create a Canary deployment workflow, and we're going to use it for our dev environment. From the workflow type, I can pick Basic, Multi-Service, Canary Deployment, Rolling Deployment, or Blue-Green. I'm going to pick Canary. I'm going to select my environment and click Submit. The first thing we get is a wizard that guides us through how to configure our deployment. Before we do anything, we can do a pre-deployment step. So I could run a shell script. I could make a REST call to a third-party product like a security scan. I can even point it to my Jenkins server, and I can run a Jenkins job. We also do the same for Bamboo plans. And so it's very easy to reuse all of your existing kind of CI and deployment scripts. Once we've got pre-deployment out of the way, we can then define our Canary phases. So my first phase of my Canary is I'm going to pick up my order service, deploy it to my environment in Amazon. And when we upgrade the containers, I'm going to upgrade 10%. I can pick absolute count if I want to do that. Once we've upgraded 10% of the environment, I'm then going to pick the tools that I want to use to verify. So I'm going to verify using AppDynamics. I'm going to point it to my controller. I'm going to pick my application name, give it the tier group, and then for 15 minutes, we're going to look at the performance of my application. I'm also going to point it to Splunk. And for 15 minutes, we're going to look at application errors and exceptions. I can also choose as well custom verifications. So I could do HTTP assertions. I could ping a health check page on the application and look for certain responses. I could run a shell script, or I could even run a Jenkins job if you've already got some verification or validation set up. So that's the first phase of my Canary. It's going to deploy at 10% of the environment, and it's going to look for performance and errors using AppDynamics and Splunk. If it fails, it's automatically going to roll back the containers. You can also reference your database rollback scripts here if that's something you want to manage. If you don't want automatic rollback, you can simply remove it, and you can take whatever action you want using shell scripts, using REST, or even Jenkins jobs or Bamboo plans. It's pretty flexible. So that's the first phase. If it completes, what we can do is go back and we can copy phase 1 to phase 2, and I'm going to upgrade 50% of my environment. And given this is 50% of my environment, I want my verification to run slightly longer. So I'm going to run it for, let's say, 60 minutes. I can do the same for Splunk. For 60 minutes, I'm going to run my verification. If that succeeds, I'm going to go back and copy it for phase 3. And now I'm going to upgrade 100% of my environment. So literally in a few minutes, we've got a 3-phase Canary deployment. Notifications, it's going to post to Slack when things fail. I can edit this if things succeed or someone pauses a deployment. We also have a failure strategy that allows you to control the scope of rollback. So for example, you might not want to roll back the entire workflow. You might just want to roll back specific phases. So for example, you might have a 10 microservice deployment. If one microservice fails, you might just want to roll that one back versus all of them. Or you could even have a manual intervention. So you might not want to roll back at all. You might just want to notify that something's happened. A big one with Harness is also the ability to templatize a workflow. You can do this by clicking workflow variables, and what we can do is we can now inject parameters like artifact ID, environment ID, and even service ID. So now what you can do is many teams can use the same deployment template. And so we have one customer that used to have 174 scripts for all of their services in their environments. They've templatized one deployment workflow in Harness, and that's how they deploy. So they've gone from 170 different scripts to a single deployment template. Once you have your workflows, you can then attach them to pipelines. So let's go ahead and build a new pipeline. Stage 1 is going to be dev, and I simply reference my development workflow. If dev completes, we're going to go to stage 2, and we're going to run our QA workflow. You can have work stages in parallel. So I could have a QA2 workflow, and I might want to execute in parallel. So now both of these must succeed in order to move to the next phase. I'm going to have a manual approval, and then I'm going to then go to production. So again, in 30 seconds, we've just built a deployment pipeline from scratch. If you want to see the YAML for anything in the product, simply click the YAML button, and you'll see all of the configuration as code in the background there, as you can see. So that's the pipeline we've just created. If I scroll up, you can see there's the Canary deployment we've just created with all of the configuration. Once you've defined your pipeline, the last thing you need to do is define a trigger of when to run that pipeline. You can do that by simply creating a new trigger, picking a condition, like let's pick when there's a new build or version of my microservice, I'm going to run the pipeline. Or you can chain pipelines together. So if there's dependencies across applications, you can simply say when another pipeline completes, I want to run this pipeline. I can run it at specific times of the day or the week. Or I could pick webhook. So I'm going to pick webhook. I'm going to pick the pipeline that I just created. And then I'm going to use the last collected artifact from my repository. And that's my trigger defined. So now when I click submit, I can look at the trigger. There's the webhook. There's the curl command if I want to inject parameters into it. And so now it's fully automated. Whenever someone runs this webhook, it's going to run my deployment pipeline. So that's how easy it is to build a pipeline from scratch. We also have continuous security. So there's a complete audit trail of everything that happens across your applications, your environments. So if anyone does anything, it's all logged here in an audit trail. We have complete role-based access control. So you can restrict which teams or which developers have access to what pipelines, applications, environments, etc. We also have secrets management. So you can see all of the secrets. You can see which secrets are running across what deployment pipelines and workflows, as well as who changed the secrets if passwords or keys get changed. As I mentioned, we've got integration with Amazon KMS and HashiCorp Vault. So you just put in your details there, and there's native integration across the board. Lastly, we have access management. So single sign-on support for Okta, One Login, and SAML, so you can easily integrate it within your organization. IP whitelisting, if you want to restrict the IP ranges or the devices that are allowed to do deployments. And then you've also got API keys and logon settings as well to enforce passwords and two-factor authentication if that's something you need. Lastly, we have a few dashboards. So here's a service dashboard view that shows all the applications and services. It shows all the environments and the versions that are running in those environments. And we can actually mouse over the compute nodes, and it's going to tell us who did it at what time, where it was deployed, the type of compute, the artifact. And so we've got a complete audit of what's running where across all your applications and services. So with that, that's a quick 15-20 minute demo on Harness.